So I think we are going to start. One more time, hello, dear friends, colleagues, comrades. Thank you very much for joining our small but very significant meeting. Despite the fact that we are in a fairly behind-the-scenes lineup, a lot of people are watching us on YouTube now. My name is Nikolai Akhmedov. I'm one of the organizers of the Post-Marxist Studies Scientific and Educational Project, and our initiative is a group of post-Soviet young intellectuals and students engaged in education in the field of contemporary social theory. Of course, our project acquires special significance in connection with the current political situation, when independent intellectual and student communities are persecuted and educational activities not coordinated with the state are prosecuted. So today we have an outstanding speaker, the woman whose name is in red capital letters in the history of the leftist feminist movement. One that you can endlessly admire and actually be inspired by, Silvia Federici, Professor Emerita and Teaching Fellow at Hofstra University, co-founder of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, and the Midnight Notes collective member. I propose to greet Professor Federici with virtual applause.
Thank you so much for your very generous words.
And to go on, before I hand over to Professor Federici, I'd like to invite to speak with welcoming remarks the representatives of two our fellow educational initiatives, which popularize the theory and work of our honorable guest in Russia, and helped us to highlight our meeting today. For the first point, I'd like to invite Jana, author of Freie Frauen, independent Marxist feminist project. Jana, please.
Thank you very much. Pleased to meet all of you. Yes, my name is Jana. I'm the member of a rather young group of Marxist feminists called Freie Frauen, which from German means free women. This group started with meetings organized by several left-wing activists something about 2 years ago. We read works about so-called women's issue, and that's why we are more than interested in this meeting, as Federici's book was maybe one of the most interesting and useful works that influenced my views too and helped us to understand the roots of women oppression more than I think any classical Marxist work could. We continued our investigations, wrote some articles in social nets, and no one expected the level of hate that we would get from some left-wing, as they thought of themselves then. We were bullied, blamed in attempts to squeeze the labor movement, and it all ended with like the separation of a big part of left-wing media field. I think it's a good sign that we appeared on one side with the most purposeful people who at least understand the necessity of women politicization to resolve problems. Though it's weird for me to think that many things we reopen for ourselves now used to be on the tip of discussion between feminists around 30 years ago. And we now face the same questions, like, for example, what part of women oppression is really historical, and what is the reason for it? And if the commoning of social sphere the only way to take down the suppression of care work and make the initial potential of women and men equal. So I hope this meeting will help us to make connection between generations and understand the main problems that we should face now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jana. Next, I invite Katerina Denisova, co-founder of the FemTalks project. Katerina, yield the floor, please.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here today. I'm going to read my text from the screen because I'm not very articulate in English. I'm sorry for that. As Nikolai has already said, my name is Katerina. I'm a co-founder of a feminist educational project called FemTalks, and I'm exceptionally happy to be here today because in the last couple of months, I have fully realized just how important such events and communities that are built and strengthened through them are. Today, as Nikolai has already stated, independent education and consciousness raising in Russia are under attack. There is a law in progress that directly targets educational initiatives that are critical of the government and current order of things. From the 1st of June on, online events, such as this one, most likely won't be possible. Feminism, climate action, critical theory are considered radical and harmful ideologies. Open dialogue with theorists and scientists from other countries is becoming more and more difficult each year. There is an ideology of hate and suspicion that is fostered almost daily through new bills, laws, and prohibitions. We Russians are always told that there is an enemy at our borders waiting to grab and destroy us. Much like the witches at the height of the witch hunts, activists and researchers that engage with foreign colleagues, funds, and foundations are being prosecuted and called foreign agents. Having that status means basically that you're stripped of some of the most important human rights. You are not allowed to educate and publish anything without stating everywhere that you are a foreign agent, which in the eyes of state propaganda and people susceptible to it means that you're a national enemy, an enemy of the state. So yeah, independent and honest journalists that openly criticize such initiatives are under direct attack too. Just about 10 days ago, my close acquaintances from the student media called Doxa Journal were unfairly put under domestic arrest for doing honest and just journalism and standing up for students' rights. Despite all of these horrors, we continue educating, building and fostering communities, conducting research and standing up for our rights and sharing our findings with colleagues from all over the world. I truly believe that this work all of us are doing is not in vain. And each day, each new conference and meeting, we're shifting the paradigm and move closer to a more just and fair world. It wouldn't be possible without thorough, radical, and critical research that aims to get to the bottom of things, to explain and dismantle harmful ideologies and systems of oppression. And I think the work of Silvia definitely belongs to the body of such crucial texts and provides a lot of important insights for feminists all over the world today. So I am very honored to be here in the same virtual space with her. I am personally very inspired by her work, and we are teaching Caliban and the Witch in our course, which is called Alphabet of Feminist Theory, which is also under attack in the current circumstances, but we continue to educate and spreading the ideas of feminist theorists and philosophers such as Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. We are all inspired by Silvia and your speech too. So, my sincerest thanks, girls. And now I think it's time to start. Professor Federici, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much to you all. And it's a great honor for me to be here. It's my first presentation to a Russian audience. And I'm particularly honored also considering the very difficult condition in which this is taking place. So I'm very, very happy to be here with you. What I'm going to do today, since it's my first presentation and I'm not familiar with the audience, I decided I'm going to present a discussion centered on the concept of social reproduction and explain why the concept of social reproduction has been so important, in the history of feminist struggle, not only in the United States or Europe, but I think internationally. In fact, I think it's becoming more and more important. And then look at precisely the kind of struggles that have been developing, into the presence, beginning with this perspective, moving within this perspective. I think it has been one of the great contributions of the feminist movement to actually have brought attention, to a whole sphere of activities that had been practically ignored or marginalized, by revolutionary thinking, Marxist, anarchist, revolutionary thinking, basically through the 18th, 19th century, and having in fact, made, put the spotlight, on a whole world that had been considered, a kind of vestige of a previous pre-capitalist society. And this is where the concept of social reproduction comes in. In an article that I wrote a few years ago, I have traced the history of the concept of reproduction and showing that it's a concept that enters, scientific discourse and in the 18th century, and to describe basically, the process whereby living organism, specifically mostly important plants, reproduce themselves. And then by the end of the 18th century, this concept migrated into the social sciences and was used, for example, by the physiocrats, who were the first economists of capitalist society, was used to describe how social systems reproduce themselves. Then the concept is used by Marx, and Marx uses it in two ways to speak how capitalism reproduces itself, and also how the working class reproduces. And this is the concept that we began to use, in the 1970s, in a context of debates within the surging feminist movement, debates about what are the roots, what are the bases, of the specific forms of women's oppression in a capitalist society. And this was a very important debate, which led to different political strategies for women's liberation. And of course, the debate centered on the question of domestic work, housework, reproduction, with the intent to establish what is the nature of this activity. What is the nature of this activity? More and more, from the beginning of the debate, reproduction was used in a narrow sense to indicate procreation, but more and more, instead, we started using it precisely to describe this whole sphere of activity, whereby everyday life is reproduced. And of course, we had many feminists, both liberal and socialist, who were telling us, okay, this is the problem with women. The problem that we have suffered from is that we have been confined to a sphere of activities that it's really a vestige of a previous pre-capitalist world. We are excluded from social reproduction. In fact, in a way, the dominant theme was the theme that Lenin developed, with saying that the Russian workers were not suffering from capitalist development; they were suffering from the absence of it. Right? This is what we were told by many feminists. We are suffering of the fact that we are not, in a way, the activity in which most women are engaged are not activities that are contributing to capitalist production, to capitalist accumulation. And therefore, we are powerless, because not being contributors, men can go on strike. men can withdraw their labor. They may be exploited in capitalism, but they have a certain power in their hands in that their labor is, in a way, the fuel, for the process of accumulation. We instead saw the strategy that followed from this kind of perspective was we have to enter capitalism. Entering capitalism meant joining, taking a wage job, possibly in an industrial outfit, etc. And a number of us actually, this was the debate polarized because a number of us, rejected that view. And we began a whole analysis of housework, the family, the community, and came to a very different conclusion. And the conclusion we came to was that, in fact, the opposite is the case. That in reality, this work of reproduction that includes many, many, many different activities, includes many, many different tasks, many, many different activities, from procreation to sexual work, domestic work, in the strict sense of the word, that this sphere of activity is actually, the support system of every other form of production, that far from being irrelevant, it's actually central to the reproduction of the capitalist system. Because what reproduction actually is not the reproduction of single individuals or family, is the reproduction of the workforce. In other words, our analysis, our redefinition of housework and domestic work, established that, in fact, this work, is basically the work that produces what Marx called labor power, people's capacity to work. That this capacity to work is not available all the time spontaneously. It is not a natural capacity. It has to be produced. People are consumed in the daily organization of exploitation. They are consumed, and this is what housework does, bringing those energies back, making it possible every day for millions of workers to enter the workplace, the only place that is officially recognized. So this for us was a revolution. Of course, we were criticized. We were much criticized, by the left and also by parts of the feminist movement, who basically accused us of glorifying, a area of activity that, in fact, was very backward. The organization, labor union, or the organizations of the left always had looked at house workers. We started speaking of house workers, not housewives, of house workers as a whole population of women who were backward, outside of social production, etc. And we began a whole analysis that, it's present in a number of work, basically saying, no, when we look at the capitalist organization of work, until now, we have looked at a very limited sphere. We have seen it in a way that has mutilated it, has cut into, has left out some of the most important activity, for its reproduction. And we have also begun an analysis of the wage. And we began to realize that the wage, in fact, mobilizes, the wage relation, organizes the work not only of those who are, present in wage labor, but through the wage, the work of a whole broader population, has been also organized. And the labor of a whole broader population has been exploited through the wage, which means that the amount of unpaid labor, that capitalism has been able to rely upon has been much, much wider than, for example, you can imagine by reading Marx's work. Unpaid labor, the capitalism has accumulated is not the unpaid labor contained in the wage work day, but it's the unpaid labor of millions and millions of women and children and also at times men, who have been engaged in ensuring, in providing all those activities that enable people to actually participate in the process of production. So we began to rethink the organization of work, the capitalist organization of work, and see that it's much different from what we usually conceive. That it begins in the homes and then runs through the factory, the schools, the offices, but it includes the community. The community, in a way, is the pedestal. It's the support system. Back to the wage, we also saw that the wage is an instrument, to organize labor hierarchies. And, in other words, that through the wage system, and through wage labor, the governments, capitalism, the capitalist class, has organized a whole hierarchy whereby some workers appear as workers and others seem to be outside the working class. And a hierarchy whereby the wage worker has the power to supervise and command the work of the unwaged. And this we see it in the family. We began to look at the family from that point of view. From that point of view, how the family is organized through the wage and the absence of it, right? Organized, and we realize that whereby marriage, the family, are presented as, a terrain of cooperation, right? In reality, we have an inequality. There's a fundamental inequality at the center of the family, because the wage worker, the husband, and here I'm talking about, until very recently, the husband, the wage worker, has the power to supervise, the work of his wife. And we began to rethink the question of domestic violence and realize why domestic violence was so pervasive and why, was so tolerated by the state that, it took a whole women's movement, the feminist movement, to establish that battering, beating up your wife is an assault. It's not just, it's a little marital problem, something irrelevant, something trivial. And we realized that this domestic violence is actually part of the organization of work. If, in fact, the husband, by means of the wage, one of the tasks of the husband, one of the expectations the society has, is that, he represents the state, the authority. He's the one who ensures that the reproduction takes place in the proper ways. Then we understand why domestic violence is tolerated, because we understood, interviewing women and looking at the whole experience of battered women, we realized that most of the time that violence came as a response to women's refusal of housework. She didn't want to have sex, the house was not clean enough, the children were running around, etc., etc. These were the very classic, causes for many times domestic violence. Also, the management of the money that the man earns and brings home and gives or does not give to the wife, right? So that we began to rethink the family, and of course, sexual work. Sexual work always considered the most private, the sphere of family relation has always been cataloged as private. And we realized that it was not private at all. Actually, that privacy, that concept of privacy, of the private life, had been very, very instrumental to hide the labor, to hide the exploitation, to hide the power relation. And we began to realize that, for instance, sexual work, was also part of the work, that it was part of the marriage pact, that when you married, in a way, the traditional marriage in the working class family, was a contract based on an exchange. He will bring home a wage and you will reproduce him, with domestic work and with sexual work. Until the 1990s, for example, in the United States, after a long feminist movement, right, there was no, in the law, in the legislation, there was no recognition that there can be rape in the family. Because it was always understood that by the time you married, when you married, basically in marrying, you gave the husband the right to control your body and to ask you to impose on you sexual work, sexual relation, whether you wanted it or not. In other words, until the 90s, until feminists made a whole issue of it, right, it would have been often inconceivable for a woman to say, oh, my husband raped me. What, your husband raped you? Come on, you married, right? And so we began to see also that in the case of women, sexual work was not pleasure, but actually was a duty that came together with washing the clothes, washing the dishes, taking care of the children, etc., etc. That at the end of a day of work, you couldn't say, well, I'm tired, right? And that this kind of obligation, in fact, and also the fact that for many women, marriage became a kind of economic solution because part of the sexual division of labor has meant that it's been very difficult for women, until not long ago, to find employment outside of the home or to find employment that would give a minimum of autonomy, right? And so we saw the sexuality is actually a whole terrain of power relation. Same thing with procreation, with child raising, right? In fact, when you look at procreation, you see very clearly that the terrain of reproduction is not private at all, because this has been one of the most legislated activity. For example, access to contraceptives, access to abortion, right, has been incredibly regulated by the government. The government has demanded the authority, has imposed the authority to decide, whether a woman can terminate a pregnancy or not. So this has been a revolution, a practical, theoretical, social revolution in the way, the whole sphere, a sphere that is fundamental in everybody's life, has been conceptualized. And on that basis also, a lot of our strategies, of new strategies were developed, because the classical strategy offered to us for women's liberation was, on one side, you had socialist feminists who basically told us, okay, if you, from the community, from the home, you have no power. So the strategy is gain a wage job, enter male-dominated wages, join the union, join the working class. They would tell us to join the working class, as if until you took a job outside the home, you were not part of the working class. Right? On the other hand, you had liberal feminists who basically said there's nothing problem with the capitalist system. The only problem is we're not part of it. And again, struggling to enter into male-dominated area. These were the main roads. These were the main roads of the feminist movement. And I'm going to come back to it because the historical context in which this debate took place was also very, very important. And for us, and when I mean for us, I was part of a movement that took place, grew in several countries, called the Movement for Wages for Housework. We said, no, the first things that we need to do is to deal with the question of reproduction. Because as long as this work is considered natural work, as long as this work is seen as something that is natural for women to do, is expected of women to do, as long as women will continue to do it in the conditions of the present, we will not have any power, any minimal power wherever we go, because in fact, the experience that already many of us were having was the ones we went to work outside the home. We went with a big baggage. And the big baggage is that we came from a long history of unpaid labor. And this baggage determined, the power that we had to negotiate every relationship with employers, with men, right? So that all unpaid labor meant a situation of dependency, of difficulty in negotiating conditions of work that will give us a minimum of autonomy. And I'll come back to it. I spoke of the context of the debate. The context of the debate was extremely important. If the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s were a period of great social transformation, because it was a period in which capitalism in Europe and the United States, was recognizing that they were in crisis. The 70s were the early 70s, and were a period in which many, many struggles that had been building through the 20th century, came to a peak. Think of the anti-colonial struggle, right? All through the 20th century, the building, 60s, the broad process of decolonization, which of course did not bring a completely new world, because it was a process that took place also under the governance of the United Nations. But you have a whole process of decolonization. You have the building of a big anti-war movement in the US, which was an anti-colonial movement because the Vietnam War was a colonial war. You had the student movement, right, recognizing that education was actually part, of the reproduction of capitalist relations. And you had a big movement of industrial workers. They went from Torino in Italy, Fiat, through France, Dagenham, Ford in England, Detroit, and the industrial workplace by the 70s was recognized as a place of crisis. Because what you begin to see in that period, it's a process of refusal that takes different form, but it's a process of refusal of what the regimentation, the militarization of industrial work, the regimentation of industrial work. It's very interesting when you look at the demands that begin to be made in the factories, always is less work, time out, time off. So I'm saying this because these explain why for the next 20 years you have an international capitalist class and institution who basically are engaged in a broad restructuring of the global economy. So the debate of the feminist movement over the question of housework and over the question of women's liberation, of the strategies for women liberation, takes place in a very important political, social, economic context, the context of an international capitalist class who has to restructure, who has to engage in a restructuring of the world economy, because, is besieged, has lost the power it had in the colonies with the colonization, and in a way is besieged by, struggles that are challenging the main mechanisms of exploitation, and particularly struggles that are coming. It's very important what happens in the 60s. The 60s is a very incredible moment because you have both struggles that are coming from a whole world of social subjects, who are working outside the wage relation or in a particular relation to the wage, and at the same time struggle also by workers who are at the center of the wage relation, right? The industrial worker, the nerve center of the capitalist economy. So we begin to see the restructuring. And we know now, after 30 years, 40 years, that restructuring is still going on. And we see, now we see the outlines, because we see the first step, a big process of recolonization, recolonization of large parts of Africa, Latin America, with the debt crisis, structural adjustment, the imposition of austerity, and the redefinition, in the name of economic recovery. In the name of economic recovery, the redefinition of what so-called third world countries have to do. Privatization of land, destruction of communal system, expulsion of many, many workers from the land, etc., etc. I'll come back to this issue. So you have a restructuring that on one side opens the door, to women. And, here you have this debate, and you have a whole part of the women's movement looking about entering the wage workforce as a strategy for liberation. And here is where you have a moment of marriage, a moment of meeting, apparent meeting and harmony between the United Nations representative of international capital and the large section of the feminist movement. That's where you have the birth of what I call state feminism, right? With the idea that, yes, emancipation for women is take wage work. And, of course, for some women entering, the academia, etc., produced, a serious, significant change. For the majority, has meant actually to enter into this new capitalist world, enter in condition of total precarization, poorly paid work, and a work week without end, because in addition to the work outside the home, mostly in the service sector, to some extent in industry, but mostly in the service sector, never eliminated the obligation to do reproductive work. On the contrary, what we saw is that hand in hand with a whole new set of provision that incentivized, women's entering in large number into the wage workforce, hand in hand with that, we saw the new neoliberal state reducing all the investment in social reproduction. So we have in the period between 1975 and 1995, and the process is continuing. I'm trying to make an historical map, is that what we have is a double process. We have a flow. You have a flow of women now who are entering more and more into wage labor. And at the same time, we have a government that begins to reduce the kind of investment, for example, support to daycare, support to home assistance to elderly people, and support to all kinds of activities that were, in a way, a kind of investment into the process of social reproduction, right? So we were able to see unfolding under our own eyes much of what we had basically stated in our campaign for wages for household, which is unless we tackle the question of reproduction, entering the wage workforce will not in any way fundamentally improve our condition. And in fact, we can go, maybe in the discussion period, we can go more in detail, because now we have a large amount of evidence, large amount of evidence showing that the majority of women, working class women, and here I talk about the United States because it's where the reality I know best, but have a very, very difficult life, jobs that are completely precarious, never provide the possibility of some autonomy. So, for example, most working class women who have jobs outside the home have huge debts. They have to integrate the salary, which is very low, with taking loans. And so they work, and they continuously become more indebted, right? And we have seen that long before COVID, the health situation of women has dramatically deteriorated. For example, today, working class women have less life expectancy, than they had, for example, in the early 70s, white and black. And we also have seen that women are big users of tranquilizers, antidepressants. They're using drugs enormously in order to deal with the tension. Domestic violence has increased. Domestic violence has enormously increased. And so this is the scenario. Actually, the COVID has intensified a crisis that was already there, has intensified. And the crisis is most visible when we look at what has been happening with children, right? Because, for example, in the United States, we have seen that over the last 20 years, the number of children who have been declared to have mental disabilities has enormously increased. Now they speak of 8 million children who are regularly being medicated because they have different, for instance, deficit of attention in school, hyperactivity, as well as autism. So there is a whole syndrome, which in a way is new. And one way I would explain it is also that the time, energy, resources available for children are less and less. Today, the classic working class family, when there is both man and wife, both husband and wife, is that working all day, and maybe once in a while, the whole family can be together. but there is no space, no time, no money. The resources the resources in terms of space, time, and money have continuously diminished. And of course, the situation with the elderly, which is even more catastrophic. We have seen with COVID that one of the highest places of mortality have been the nursing home that are publicly funded. Well, the situation there too, the crisis, COVID has brought to light a crisis that was already there. Less and less there's been any investment by the state or by family in the care of the elderly that are not self-sufficient. So we're really speaking of a very dramatic deterioration of the conditions of social reproduction, very dramatic deterioration, which again, the epidemic has intensified, dramatized, but not created. It preceded it. And that's what made the high mortality possible, precisely because it came on a crisis that was already there. At the same time, the concept of social reproduction, over time, has also expanded. I've been discussing social reproduction now, focusing on the question of, and the home, domesticity, the family, etc. But we have seen very soon, in fact, already beginning with the 1980s, the rise of the ecology movement, for instance, the rise of ecofeminism, right? That the concept of social reproduction had to be expanded, that included, not only the sphere of familial domestic relation, but first of all, also education, healthcare, taking place outside of the home, and the whole question of ecology, the whole question of the environment. That means lands, waters, air, right? And now we know. And this was brought, to the feminist movement, to women's struggles, particularly, by women struggling in the global South, right? Who, in addition to the whole history of imperialism and capitalist exploitation, colonization, right? By the 1980s, had to confront, the process of structural adjustment, which meant then in exchange for new loans by the IMF and the World Bank to deal with the so-called debt crisis, which was totally engineered. The debt crisis was engineered by change in the interest rate on the dollar, by the Federal Reserve of the United States. That in conjunction with that, right, in order, in the name of economic recovery, in addition to the austerity measure, which meant that governments had to disinvest in healthcare, education, etc., basic necessities, right? In addition to that, they had to open the door to all kinds of extractivist companies, oil, mining, particularly gold mining for all the strategic minerals that go into the digital economy, into the digital production, oil extraction, and then agribusiness, right? The big agribusiness has really invaded the pharmaceutical companies, who basically have discovered that it's in the, global South that you have the majority of plants and herbs that are necessary for the new pharmaceutical products, etc. So what you begin to see, right, is a whole new struggle to defend the land, to defend the land against mining, to defend the land against deforestation, to defend the land and the waters. And by land, we mean not only land, soil, we mean water, forest, animals. And this is a struggle that has been led by women, is being led by women. And not surprisingly, because it's women who stand to pay the highest price. And they are the ones being involved, in the process of reproduction, being those most responsible for the reproduction of their family. They are the ones who understand that once you lose the land, once you lose the forest, once the water that you used to drink is contaminated by mercury because you have a gold mine company that is using mercury or arsenic to separate the rock from the gold, the soil from the gold. Once you do that, then your community is dead. Then your community is lost, right? And so we have a tremendous struggle that is taking place now on this question. And there's a new kind of feminism. There's a new kind of feminism that is emerging. And I know that I don't want to speak more than an hour, but actually there's a lot more to say. There's a feminism now that understands that there's a profound connection between the struggle, over the day-to-day process of reproduction, whether it is procreation, sexual work, domestic labor, the sexual division of labor between men and women, right? And also the struggle over the environment, the struggle for the protection of land, forest, and the two are, inseparable. The two are inseparable. And this, of course, is being brought out also, by the question by the pandemic, because it's very clear that one of the reasons why we have seen such a high level of mortality, even countries that are considered generally rich countries, certainly has to do with the defunding of the sanitary system. But it has also to do with the fact that our own bodies, the immunity of our own bodies has continuously been degraded, right? The fact that we're breathing air that it's more and more contaminated, drinking water that is full of chemicals, eating food that has no nutrition power, because as Marx said, capitalist development, exhausts the soil as much as exhausts human beings. It exhausts the soil, right? And so we are eating food that is full of pesticide, full of, the remnants of herbicide and so on. So this is the framework. And there is a feminist movement that also understands that when we speak of production and reproduction, we have to really change the whole perspective. We should not look at production and reproduction as, not only separate, but even complementary spheres, because it's actually one process. And actually the process, what we call reproduction, in a way is the broadest, because the concept of reproduction, in a way, is the one that looks at the whole machine of work, labor, social change from the point of view of the recreation of life, from the point of view not of the production of commodity, but of the recreation of life. And so in that way, as feminists in Spain have often said, it places the question of life at the center. And it looks at the struggle over labor and social change from the point of view of the entire individual, not the worker, intended, as a kind of separate category. So I think that there is a new conception, and also we have seen, the return of a struggle, over the question of reproduction that for many years had become very, very limited. because so much of the energy had gone into entering into male-dominated jobs, changing the conditions of wage work. And now we are seeing that there is a refocusing, a refocusing that precedes, the epidemic. That precedes the epidemic. And for example, began in Europe and the US, began already around in the last in 20 years, with the growth of movements of domestic workers, women who do domestic work for wages, which was the import truly of thousands and thousands of women coming from the global south, migrant women who forced to leave their countries, because of the recolonization process, because of structural adjustment, forced to leave their country and coming into the more well-to-do to basically do the housework that now women here less and less have time to do. So for example, if you go to the parks in New York, on an average day, you will see Black women, African women, Caribbean women, Filipino women taking care of children, whose mothers have jobs outside the home. And of course, their condition reflects all the devaluation that reproduction has suffered in capitalist society. Because the fact that this work has never been seen as real work has an immediate consequence for the women who are doing this work as a form of employment. But this movement has been particularly important because, in a way, the movement of domestic workers, who are mostly women who come from the former colonial world, I would say still a colonial world, except that now colonization is taking place through fiscal, financial means. The colonization has not ended, except that now the agent of colonization, are the World Bank, IMF, the World Banks, the corporate world, etc. But these women have brought together to the feminist struggle, right, the perspective from the South, the perspective of the struggle against racism, the perspective of the struggle against imperialism and colonialism, and all this viewed from the point of view of how capitalist society has systematically, in so many different ways, obviously affecting people, women, population in different forms, right? But centered on the continuous devaluation of our reproduction, which is really the devaluation of our lives, right? And one of the things that I've been repeating as a mantra, right, is that, in this society, if you're part of a war industry, an industry that produces weapons, you are a productive worker. If you are a woman who spend a lot of time and energy taking care of children, taking care of the elderly, giving life, reproducing life, you're not considered productive. You're not considered making a contribution to the well-being of society. This, to me, in a way, in a nutshell, shows what is the logic that governs this world, and what we are up against, and why the concept of social reproduction is so important, and why the struggle over the transformation and of this work, and which is the transformation not only of women's life, but of the society as a whole. And we can talk more in detail about what are the strategies that are most effective, what is that we need to do, obviously, to effect this change. But the question is the direction of the change, and the importance of the feminist movement in this context is to have shown more than any other previous, political perspective, that the logic that governs this system is a logic that is not life affirming. And this is what we need to change. Thank you very much.
Professor Federici, thank you very much for your presentation. I think we can now move on to the discussion, to the questions. And before we read out the questions from our YouTube broadcast, let's see if the video conference participants have any questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand or write to the chat. So, and the first question is, Professor Federici, have you heard anything about the social movement in Russia and about our country? And can you give any assessment of the current situation in Russia, or maybe something about the USSR, your attitude, and some kind of that?
Again, we have 3 questions, so that let's get at least 2 or 3 questions, and then I will reply in groups of 3. Can we do that?
Yes, of course. So, have you heard anything about the social situation and social movement in Russia?
Yeah. That's one. Yeah.
The second. Yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead. But give me this.
Okay. Can you give any assessment of the current situation in our country? So, quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe something about your attitude to the USSR.
Right. These questions are much more difficult for me to reply, because I don't have a direct, experience, and I've seen that there's been feminist movement in the USSR. I began also some correspondence, and this has been extremely important. The story of the USSR has been so fundamental in so many ways, from the story of the Russian Revolution, and then, in more recent history, one of my, closest knowledge, not closest, but it's been what I've read and I followed over for a number of years, the consequences of the transition of the end of what some have called realized socialism. And how, despite the, repressive character of the Soviet Union in many ways, and nevertheless, the transition to capitalism has certainly not brought the kind of prosperity and well-being, And I've been reading. All kinds of books were described, for instance, the terrible level of impoverishment for a number of years. How devaluation, people having to sell all their things, in the streets, and so, in a way, what I've learned, one of the things that I've learned, is that a confirmation that the institution, of capitalist relation, right? It's always based on massive processes of dispossession, as always based on the reconstruction of social hierarchy, possibly in a different ways, but the creation of new hierarchies. And so this has been, one important point, to see. And then, of course, we have the problem. There's so much of the information about the Soviet Union, about Russia today, comes also through the medias and in the United States. So we know of the struggles that are taking place today. We see almost daily, representation of people in the street, people fighting against autocracy, people fighting. Frankly, to us, it seems like one world. To tell you the truth, more than these great differences, it appears to us that perhaps in societies like the United States, the form of repression are much more managed. There is a higher capacity to create differentiation among part of the population. So that, for example, in the United States, you may have part of the population who have a very idyllic or form of life. But if you then went and lived in the many Black communities, for example, you would see, probably that almost every day for the last few years, the police has killed a Black person with total immunity and for the most irrelevant reasons, practically killing people who were disarmed. And so when we hear, we see people protesting against and demanding, social change, demanding a transformation, to us seem a continuation of much of the forms of repression. The text may be different character, but it's not substantially. In other words, when I today hear, read, listen, I do not conclude, this is a repressive world and we live in the free world. This is not where I come from. And I am very aware that people in Russia are struggling, and they're struggling for a systemic change. I'm also aware that this is what is happening here. And in that sense, there is a continuity that has different forms, because different histories. So I don't know if this is probably not a very satisfactory, but I try to speak most about what I know directly.
Thank you for your position. And another question, Makretsova Katya, please.
Can you hear me?
So I hear you very well.
Thank you so much for your speech. I was so inspired by your book, and I'm so glad that this meeting exists, because sometimes I feel that intellectual climate in Russia is so separated from European movements and some theories, and I'm very happy that this meeting is possible. And yes, I just can thank you. Want to thank you. And I have maybe not a question, but some kind of remark that I think in consequences of precariation of labor, having a homework and even having a home becoming a privilege.
Yeah.
And I think this some of upside down in structure of labor, and I don't even know what to do with this, and how can we think about it?
Yeah. No, you're so right. You're so right. When we speak of social reproduction, I mean, I went into some of the basics. I haven't even begun to speak of a lot of the specifics today. And what you say is so important. And it's even broader, because having a home in a broad, more and more, the worker is a migrant. What we have seen over the last 30 years is that a large millions and millions of people as a consequence of capitalist development, which is supposed to bring prosperity and modernity and whatnot, have been pushed out from their ancestral land, have been forced to migrate to every part of the world, and the right to have a place, the right to the place where you were born, where you were, etc. And then homelessness. You come to any major city in the United States, for example, and particularly if you go towards the south, where the weather is good, you will see encampments. You go to California, Los Angeles, etc., you see encampments. You see that now thousands and thousands of people live in tents and live in basically in the street. And the right to have a home is being lost, right? So, for example, during the COVID, the propaganda on television, it told, wash your hands and stay home, stay home, wash your hands. And you have so many hundreds of thousands of people who have no home, who have no water. Even those, in many cities, for instance, the water system has been so degraded in terms of upkeep, the people could not even wash their hands. They had, we have seen that in Texas, we have seen that Flint, Michigan, etc. So this is now, we are facing a phase in capitalist development, where the attack on social reproduction, on people's ability to reproduce themselves, on the resources available to them, is becoming more and more serious, more and more destructive, where the right to be able to stay in your country, the right to be able to have a home and to have the means of reproduction is taken away. I don't know if they have, if you are aware of what is happening now at the border, in California, in the United States, that there is an amazing crisis of unprecedented proportion, because you have now a constant flow that has been going on for months of people with families, children, from Honduras, from Mexico, from Guatemala, from countries in which more and more people cannot survive because there is no job, because there is a tremendous amount of repression, because there are death squads, because there are forms of exploitation that are very brutal. And so they migrate, and then they encounter at the border here the same amount of, they are turned back, and it's a total disaster. All along the border of the United States with Mexico, there are now detention centers with thousands and thousands of children, thousands and thousands of people, who are, and the crisis is growing, but this is happening all over the world. This is happening all over the world. And this is what we are struggling against.
Thanks. Now, Tatiana Churko, please.
Thank you. Good day. Thank you for your talk. I have a little bit of historical question. You talked about the discussions about social reproduction in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And
60s
and it made me,
yeah.
And it made me think about the domestic workers movement in the 30s, especially Black domestic workers. And I wanted to ask, what was in these discussions? Have you seen or have you observed or how you feel the connection between these different movements? Because the social reproduction is highly racialized, and early on, Black activists and women of color started unionizing and struggle against the domestic servitude, and then started at the beginning of the 20th century. But then in the 60s, we see the new wave of these discussions, and often they ignore this racialized component. And today, when we look at the COVID, we see that the majority of essential work is conducted by the people of color in US and also in Russia. So it's also important to see this historical connection. And I'm interested what you think. Can you elaborate more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. absolutely right. The domestic work in the particularly in the upper middle class and less in the working class. I mean, much less. But in the upper middle class, it's been done by Black women since the end of slavery, and has always been connected with slavery. And in the 70s, and it's true that when we organized, for example, the campaign for wages for housework, the question of paid domestic work was there. A number of the groups in the United States and Canada also discussed the whole issue and organized around the question of domestic work. But in a way, at least initially, with less sense of urgency, because mistakenly, it seemed that that kind of domestic work was becoming more and more and more reduced, in the sense that only very rich family would have a domestic worker, and that many women who in the 30s would have gone, Black women, would have gone into domestic work, preferred to go in any other type of job, because that kind of relation was too close to a form of servitude, was too close to a form of slavery, was too difficult to impose in the one-to-one, individualized, invisibilized work, within the walls of one family to have. So that we had the idea that this domestic work was kind of on the way out, right? And the most women, when they thought about, I'm going to work outside the home, they would think of any other kind of job, not to wanting to the kind of really difficult one-to-one relation. Or you're one of the family, so they always ask you to do extra hours, particularly if you're living in the home, it's right. But this has changed enormously, beginning with the mid-80s, when now you begin to see, actually, right now, paid domestic work, 80%, 90% is racialized. It's Caribbean, African, and Asia. And they are the ones who are now making the struggle. And this is true also in Europe. And so actually today, their work, it's really central, particularly from the point of view of strategy. This movement has brought back, even before COVID, has brought back the question of reproduction at the center, of feminist thinking, feminist organizing. And and I was saying before, it's a movement that is especially important because also connects all the issues, sexism, racism, coloniality. It connects all of this and shows the continuity between the struggle, And when we began to look at the issue of domestic work as unpaid labor, right? This was an important perspective, because already we could see that the relationship between, capitalism organization of domestic work, of reproductive work, and the organization, for example, of all the forms of unpaid labor that you have in the colonial world, right? Today, with the struggle of domestic workers, all of that is coming out in a very, very powerful form. And, I've been, over and over stating the feminist movement, as a whole, has to make the struggle very central. Yeah, because I think that unless, we also have a broader struggle that deals with the issue of reproduction, For instance, the fact that we need to bring many more resources, force the government, force a rechanneling of the use of the social wealth, right? In other words, right now, reproduction is starved, is devalued, is a degraded area of life. All the money that is allocated. Now we have a new president of the United States who says that he's going to invest in care work. We are going to see it. We are going to see. But certainly, I think that the feminist struggle has to force a massive rechanneling of the way the social wealth. We want end to the investment in war, end to the investment in armament, end to the investment of all destructive activities. We want, in fact, massive funds in all kinds of ways put at the service of reproduction. And we also are struggling to have a restructuring of this work, away from the nuclear family. I mean, I'm not proposing, the kind of barrack-style reproduction that was talked about, at the beginning, perhaps, of the Russian Revolution, when the idea that the state organizes this big, but certainly the way the reproduction is being organized, through the nuclear family, it's a way that is destructive from every point of view, in terms of the kind of social relation it creates, not only the inequality, right, but the isolation, the individualization, and the walls that it creates. And so the idea of building forms of reproductive work that are more collaborative, more cooperative, right? The communization of reproductive work, right? So I think we need a broad movement that at the same time struggle to change the condition of reproduction in the community and the condition of reproductive domestic work done for pay. The two are inseparably linked. Unless we have also millions of women who are doing this work not for pay, joining the struggle, joining in the struggle to transform this work, to put an end to its devaluation, which really means to transform the society. It means to change the logic on which this society is based, because the logic of this society is a logic of wealth accumulation and obtained by reducing more and more and more, the space, time, and resources, to the point that now people don't even have a home, to the point that now people are forced to even leave the places where, for thousands of years, their communities have thrived.
Thanks. And Zanna, please, your question.
Thank you very much again for the lecture. I think, inspired us once again. I wanted to say that here in Russia we have the similar processes that you mentioned. Like the percentage of working men and women is almost the same. At the same time, we have like the processes of the industrialization and the population of precariat rises. We have the lower levels of education and medical care too. And the labor force in Russia has started to organize not long ago, and it just tries to appear. And even now, it's obvious that yes, men are much more politicized. Women are still live in the separate world, though they work, they get money, but yes, it's like what you explained, the emancipation doesn't appear because of it. So now our also Marxist leaders here, and not only of them, they try to find ways to find another ways of force the women to take part in the politicization, and they try to find the ways connected with production process, reproduction of the society process. That's why one of my main questions is, have there been any methods also already tried in Europe and USSR? For example, we know about the women's strike in USA and in Poland.
But can you say that again? We know
about women's strikes in like Poland, in USA, in Mexico. We also, from your articles in New York Times, for example, I read about the examples of communization of social sphere. And yes, so my question is, if, for example, we are like most normal people living in Russia in like these big buildings, like in flats, what can we do to struggle against the form of production organized by the capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's a whole history. I've been, for instance, in terms of, for example, housing struggle. The housing has been a major issue in social justice movement and also in women's movement, because we said the home, the house is our factory. This is the place where women spend most of their work, and the condition of housing, how much we pay for it, the space, etc. It's a big determinant of our time, our exploitation, a condition of our life. So organizing buildings, organizing has always been one of the basically tasks of housing struggle. And I think that perhaps it'll be possible to try to, the important thing is to have spaces, create spaces where women can come together, have discussion, have collective decision making. Now, of course, with COVID, it's going to be very difficult, no? But maybe when the spring comes, then people can find spaces on the outside. But to each, for example, building or neighborhood has a set of problems, right? In terms of space, in terms of money, in terms of is there a place where children can be safely, right? And these are issues that are very important to all women. Regardless of whether you've read Marx or not read Marx, whether you are politicized or not politicized, having a space for the children, having the way the house is organized, how much money do you pay, whether you get water, hot, etc. So this will be a beginning to have conversation with women, to have conversation on issues that have a direct impact on women's life every day. And we have learned that, when you begin, maybe you start with a house and finding a place for the children to play, or, finding a way of reducing the rent, something. But when you begin with that, and then women come together, then a lot of other issues. It never stays just about housing. Then women talk about marriage, they talk about sex, they talk about, you know, from one conversation, because they're all connected. How, you know, what space you have in the family. For example, this, you can do an analysis of the home, the space in the home, and see that it's totally sexualized. You know, usually it's the man who has the space. If there's a little extra space, he gets the space, right? It's very difficult for women to have any space for their own in a home. But all these issues, these are all issues that are connected, you know. So I think that one point of entry in terms of organizing with other women is, for example, to begin with issues that are very, very important. They might not be recognized in the official point of view as political issues. We have changed the concept of what is politics. The feminist movement has changed the notion, right? The concept of the personal is political. It's not to say that my personal problem is already political, but to say that the area of life that is called personal, that is called private, that is called intimate, is actually not private, not intimate, not personal at all. Because actually we have a state, we have a social system that comes into it, that shapes it, shapes how many hours we work, shape what kind of homes, kitchens we have, shapes whether I can use contraceptives or not, what kind, shapes whether, you know, my own body, my own sexuality, my own procreation, it's shaped by legislation that is passed by governments. So there's nothing really private. Women know more than any other subject in their own body, you know, that the private is not private, because man and the state have always decided about how we act, you know, how, again, you know, our own, you know, life is regulated. So I think if we start from those issues, you know, that are so vital, that are the cause of so much suffering, they are the cause of so much pain, they are the daily crisis the women, you know, I think that this is a point of entry to bring together, to have conversation with women who otherwise say, I'm not political, I don't have time for these things, I don't want to hear about these things. Right? Again, we change the concept. Political is not only when you are outside in the street with a banner. It's also something different. So
thank you. The question from our YouTube chat is too close to previous two questions, so I think we'll skip it. And last but not least, so Professor Federici, how do you see a bright future if you try to outline a social political ideal?
kind
of open, but maybe
this is a small question, eh? Okay, yes. So I'm going to answer very briefly, because on one hand, you know, I'm in a very contradictory mood, very, very contradictory. On one side, I'm very optimistic because I see a growth, I see a maturation, particularly of social justice movements in general, and in particular of the feminist movement. I'm very excited about the rise of a new feminism that comes from the global south. I'm very excited. I've been very inspired, very moved by movement of women in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, where you have, and also in Spain, where you have really feminism. Feminism is the leading social struggle in the urban and in the rural area. And it's mostly women, and because of that, women are paying a big price. There is a, you know, the notion of feminicide, you know, the fact that starting around 2000, we begin to hear more and more of feminicide and of a big surge of violence against women. domestic, but also public and institutional, right? So, but I see that this because there is a vision, I was mentioning before, is a vision that says, yeah, all these struggles are connected and we need to build this struggle, this connection. Women fighting around ecology, solidarity economy, women struggling, as nurses in the hospital, around healthcare, women struggling also in the factory. What kind of production? I think we can rethink what production is from the point of view of reproduction. Why producing poisons? Why producing weapons? Why producing anything that is destructive? So, in a way, when you put life at the center, when you put life as a priority, prosperity, and also building a society more and more organized around self-government, right? Not with this repressive institution hovering over us, not with enough with military, enough with war, enough with killing. I think the women have to really unite around enough with a world dominated by war, tortures, armed production, repressive system of surveillance. I think that this is all part of reproduction, of a struggle over reproduction. So I am comforted that this movement is growing. I'm very dispirited because I see that, on the other hand, the violence of the social system that is dominating the world. I honestly believe that there is one logic, one global logic that takes different forms, as always in the history of capitalism. As always, you are exploited in a different way in Detroit or in some colonial situation. But always in the history of capitalism, exploitation has taken different form. Look at the history. It begins with slavery. Slavery has grown hand in hand with wage labor. And many people will say today, slavery is not over. In the United States, in the Black communities, many today would say slavery is not over. We have 2 million people, mostly young Black men, incarcerated. Social changes being incarcerated. Many are incarcerated for very futile, for crimes, in quote, that in the past were not considered crimes. And so this is a way of incarcerating a population that is seen as very combative, as wanting to change the world, etc., etc. So I'm pessimistic about the increase of violence, but at the same time, I feel very strongly. And to finish this, I don't ask myself, do I have a guarantee that what we are doing is going to succeed? I'm saying, you have to do it. We have to, as long as we are alive, we have to struggle, because there's really no other meaning to this life than to fight against injustice, and then to fight to eliminate whatever is destructive in our society.
Well, I think I will express the collective opinion that we are very happy and very satisfied. So thank you very much for your presentation one more time and for answering the question. Of course, it was really amazing. I think it was clear from our burning eyes, and indeed, as Katerina from Film Talk said, such events are something special for us, and unfortunately, in the near future, it may be forbidden, but I thank you anyway for the bottom of my heart. And I want to say until we meet again, and let's stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you to you all, and it was very a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that this conversation is going to continue. Thank you so much, and a big hug to all of you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.